Hey everybody, we are Martin, Robert, and Francis, and this is Snakes and Otters, a pointless discussion of eternal questions. Get ready, we're about to live in your head rent-free. Hi, I'm Martin.
I'm Francis.
And I'm Robert.
So, welcome back to Snakes and Otters, episode 2 and 3. Again, a pointless discussion of eternal questions. So, as always, I like to bring in the stuff that I've been reading. I'm reading The Sleepwalkers by Christopher Clark. This is a book about the European powers stumbling into World War I.
Oh, goody.
So, the question is, who's to blame? What comes down to us, the standard history is, of course, the Germans had to what would you call it? They had to own up to it in the Treaty of Versailles.
That's right. They had to take full blame, as was written out, which was one of the points of contestment.
Well, it was asinine, really.
It was, but the victors write the treaties, it seems.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we have that. We have Serbian perfidy. We have the alliance system. Explain some of it, and then of course there's a big part of it that kind of comes down to us of the Russian commitment to their Slavic and Orthodox brethren. But is that really so? And this is a really good material that Clark brings up here in challenging all of this.
Good. I think it needs to be reevaluated. At this, the century mark later for the end of the war, which is literally days away from us.
Yeah,
That's right. November 11th. It's just within 30 days.
11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month.
That's correct. A reevaluation of this, because I think we can start with the premise of however it started, wherever it ended was totally different.
Yeah. One thing that makes World War I, or the Great War, so problematic in understanding is not just the multiple players. Because you think about it, Europe had not seen a war that involved this many countries all at war at the same time for centuries. Because even Napoleon didn't take on everybody at the same time.
Close, but not quite.
Yeah, but I mean, he marched across Europe, but it's not like they all gathered together. Because we know most of the war was that we think of as in the East, but there was the Western Front, or the Eastern Front, I mean, with the Russians, same as with World War II. But we're focused always on the Western Front with Germany and France and Great Britain and everything in France. But anyways, sorry, I got off the point there. My point is that this war, in many ways, it's two things. It's the John the Baptist of wars, in the sense that John the Baptist is the last Old Testament prophet.
Yes.
He's also the first New Testament prophet.
At the same time.
At the same time. This is the last 19th century / imperialist kind of war.
Right.
But it's also the first modern war. Because it starts out, for a lot of those same kind of reasons that things went on leading up to the 20th century. It was about, in many cases, individual rulers and their alliances,
right,
and thinking in terms of power grabs for land and what have you.
A very imperialistic mindset.
Yeah, a very imperialistic mindset.
And it's the first appearance of nationalism.
Yes.
Which is antithetical to imperialism.
It becomes an ideological conflict unlike any in the past. So, you're right. The last...
Yeah. Even Napoleon was just yet another absolute ruler.
Yeah, he's just
another absolute ruler.
The first new style...
How is it ideological?
It's racial, too. But it's also a conflict of autocracy and nationalism and theology and...
I understand the concept of nationalism because that's what comes out of it. And autocracy is what goes into it. And it's a big changeover. All the empires of Europe, the great powers, if we will, are destroyed. The only thing that comes out on the other side are France and Britain, unchanged. But even their mindset and understanding of themselves as countries, as powers, is totally changed as well. In fact, the American experience is totally different after the fact. We are now a nation of our own, on our own standing. We are no longer, and that's what everybody else comes away with. Unfortunately,
Finish that thought. We are no longer what?
we are no longer a pawn for the American experiences. We are no longer a pawn of Europe. We are on the same level playing field with them, and as great
You
as
think
they
this
are.
only happens at World War One?
Absolutely.
Really?
Oh, Teddy Roosevelt tried. Believe me, he tried. The Great
yeah.
White Fleet and all the rest of
The
it.
Spanish-American War does establish us as
As a world power.
don't mess with us. We're going to do what we please.
I mean, we took
But
down
it
one
was
of the ancient powers.
True,
Spain.
but it was untested truly until we won World War One. It was implied. It was a big stick. There were some maybe did not challenge it.
Maybe it was a validation of.
That is correct.
I wouldn't say it. At best, it's a validation of what happened before,
That's
not
correct.
the beginning. And I don't think you can
Yeah,
say that.
I think you need to grab hold of Robert Mary's President McKinley book.
That was
Because we talked about it
Europe.
before.
What my point is, Europe considered us upstarts and
Yes, but
ridiculous.
see, what I'm caught on is your pawn terminology. I don't think Americans ever thought of themselves as that way.
Oh no, not at all. No,
But that's what you just said.
I believe Europe thought of us as
Okay,
that.
well, that's a different thing.
Europe-
That's a different
Europe-
thing.
we
But
never
even
thought
then,
of
I
us-
don't think they thought of us as
No,
pawns.
they didn't. They thought of us as competitors, but very young.
Only
competitors.
if you mean pawns, as in the little guy on the playing field.
That's exactly what I mean.
Well, see, that's most people. When you hear pawns, you're going to think the guy that I tell what to do.
No, not
I'm,
at all.
You know, I'm
these
manipulating
are
him.
these are the jokes and the upstarts.
Yeah,
That we've been doing this over here in Europe for so long, and you guys have been here for this amount of time. Don't mess with us.
Well-
We're the major leagues. You guys are just the farm team. That is the attitude. And after World War
That
One,
I
that
like a
is
little-
completely changed.
That analogy I like a little bit more.
And I hate to do this, but I'll give Wilson some credit for that, because his ambition to be seen as a major world power was one of the few things that he did bear some fruit. Okay. I think he was also seen as a joke. I think
Well, nobody took his post-war plans seriously.
that is correct, and he was very much. If you read a little bit about Wilson's triumphal tour after the war in Europe, he was considered, France in particular, he was an absolute joke. They adored him because he won the war for them, but all of his plans about coming over here and making all these great peacemaker, that's where the whole business they quickly reverted back into their old ways, saying, who are these idiots? You know, let us handle this. You know, go back into the other room and hurt some squirrels. Why don't you? That's what we're talking about.
Well, let me wind us back just a little bit back to blame, though, and I want to bring this what Clarkus brings through in this Sleepwalker book, as the name kind of implies. The European powers stumbled into it.
Yes.
Absolutely.
That again,
The
what
fuse
we
was lit
as
and
history
no one could
kind of
stop it.
understand is the blame is the alliance systems.
That's right.
Or whatever. He's saying, look, there's enough blame to go around.
There is.
In particular, what I found fascinating is the Russian role in starting the war.
Via the alliance systems?
No. What are the Russians always about? Warm water.
Right, yeah. Warm water ports.
So their fixation on the Dardanelles leads them, and you have to also remember too, we tend to think of the autocrats in both Germany and Russia as being important. Really, their tales are really tales of incompetence.
Generally speaking.
Nicholas was completely out of his depth,
That's correct.
and Wilhelm wasn't much better.
No.
He was seen as like a complete psychopath, basically.
Absolutely. But he had a lot of power. And the cult
But
of
he
the
did
warrior
not use
cult
his
with
power.
That's correct.
He did not use it. He pushed it off to the counselors.
Well, however, the warrior culture of Germany that had been fostered for hundreds of years took on a life of its own. The Junkers and all the rest of them were very much what ran Germany.
Yeah. Well,
the whole Prussian thing. I mean, you got to remember the Prussians are.
Masters of war.
Yeah, that's their thing. So
That's their claim to fame. So yeah, you're correct.
And that's what Kaiser Bill was. He was a Prussian.
well, and he. Let's phrase it this way: if there was a Twitter that Wilhelm had access to, he would have been that guy that tweeted one thing one day and something else the next that was completely contradictory.
Right.
Like a certain prominent.
Are you saying that we might have a modern day Kaiser somewhere?
We have someone with the same temperament, I believe.
Well, yeah,
you could. So, what I found fascinating about this is the Russian fixation on the Straits, the Dardanelles, and warm water, and their feeling that the Ottoman Empire is known as the sick man of Europe for a reason.
Correct. But it has all this access.
The Russians are foreseeing that there's going to be a dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire, and they want in on the front end of that. What they see as the kickoff then of this dismemberment is a generalized European war. And where's the best place to start a war? Of course, the Balkans, because that's also going to be right there.
Within their sphere of influence.
Within that sphere, right there on the Dardanelles and everything too. Well, what's the best way to start a war in the Balkans? Piss off the Austrians. So their focus is on, well, how do we antagonize the Austrians? The Austrians and the Russians almost came to a war in 1909, full mobilization, and that incident, as Clark describes it, this becomes the thing that changes the strategic outlook now of all the alliance partners, because the Austrians cannot afford to mobilize, demobilize, blah blah blah, back and forth. It costs too much money.
Yes.
And
they are in many ways also a sick man of Europe.
Yes, it continually tests the loyalty of all of these nationalities, because they all got to leave the harvest, leave their jobs, whatever. And if they are getting frustrated with all of this melting pot of Austria-Hungary. So, of course, France only cares about Germany. They don't care about Austria. But the only way for France to survive, in their minds, Germany's onslaught, is if Russia realigns against Germany and not Austria. And the only way that's going to happen is if they accede to Russian feelings about, well, the Balkans are the tinder box.
Yes, which ultimately turned out to be.
Yeah. And so French financial assistance to the Russians becomes basically conditional on the Russians redoing their whole railroad network so that they can concentrate against the Germans. And so then you got the Brits, who, we tend to think of them having this competition with the Germans, but the Brits really thought, well, we've already beat the Germans, we don't care. Their concern was playing nice to the Russians. The Russians are the real threat, because they're the ones that have access to Persia, which means they have access to oil, which means they could disrupt Britain, changing from coal-fired to an oil-fired navy, and threaten India. So the Brits decided it's much better to try to appease and go along with the Russians than it is to try to have a détente with the Germans.
Germans have nothing to offer either of these people.
And that is a big piece of it too, because now the Germans are feeling more and more and more isolated because nobody wants to play nice with them.
That's right. And they
because
themselves,
nobody can get there's no point to it.
Well, that's right. There's nothing that the Germans can provide them other than military esprit de corps, and that's seen as competitive anyway.
Well, and there's, the Germans and the Russians tried to have détente some and get along, but there was still no point. Again, there was a period of time the Brits and the Germans had détente, but once the Brits kind of decided, well, we've won the naval race,
yeah,
it's more important to prop up France and be France's buddy and appease Russia, which helps us be France's buddy.
Right.
And so the more of this stuff that happens...
Give me a reason why France and Russia, why that alliance worked. What did they give each other?
Well, France felt like they could not survive an onslaught of the Germans.
That is correct. France's courting of Russia makes good sense. Why did Russia care?
For the same reason. Well, yes, but I mean, even though Russia is huge and have lots of resources, they're still backwards compared to the rest of Europe.
Correct.
They knew this. I think this has been a sore point
ever since Napoleon.
Well, yes,
but after the Russo-Japanese War, it really came home to them.
Yes,
because they got their clock cleaned.
Yeah, they got clock cleaned by Japan. Tiny little country.
Yeah, at least in the naval sense, they held their own on land.
And they've also
but they felt like they had recovered from that. There's a big part of this too, is that
right? But you still have to prove that. But so because Germany, because you got to remember, there's no Poland at this time. Germany and Russia are going to be
well. Germany, Austria, and Russia are all at the cornerstone.
Right, but my point is, though, there's no buffer between Germany and Russia.
To steal a line from Star Trek VI, the Russians felt they had an aggressive species with a toehold on their territory.
Yeah, you could say that because since Poland was pretty much divided between the two of them,
but here's the
thing. Everybody considered Poland theirs.
Yeah. Right. What drives Russian strategic thinking is the Straits. Is their feeling that eventually there's going to be a dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire,
and
they must have some influence in the Balkans in order to be at the table when that's carved up.
And they see France and Britain holding key cards in that dismemberment.
Well, they know that they'll be at the table too.
That's correct.
Well, because they're the great powers.
Yeah, France's strategic concern is they don't feel they can hold the Germans off alone. And therefore, they must prop up Russia and turn Russian attention away from Austria to Germany.
While we're on this, we're talking about the Balkans and how that's important for this. You made a comment earlier that I want you to either explain away or explain.
Yeah.
Because you made it sound like the Russians are sitting there thinking, we need to start a war. Where are we going to do it? Let's do it in the Balkans. So you're saying the Russians put up the Serbian nationalists to assassinate the Archduke and his...
Not so much, but they took advantage of...
the tension that was already there?
Yeah, I mean, look, everybody thought the Serbians were giant dicks. Yeah. The Russians took advantage of that.
Yes.
They made a choice because they courted Bulgaria at first. But they ended up with the Serbians because they did feel like they had a little bit more...
controllability?
Control, a little bit more where they could kind of...
influence.
And they had some relationship and they had some pro-Serbs.
Because they're ethnically very similar. They're Slavic, mostly. Serbs are.
Well,
they saw
but they also
as
felt like, again,
connected.
They're closer to where the decision's going to be made. They're closer to the Straits than the Bulgarians.
Okay.
And again, a lot of this begins to tie financially because the French are also propping up the Serbians. So the French are propping up the Russians with loans. They're propping up the Serbians with loans. There's no more money left for Bulgaria, so Bulgaria turns to the Germans for loans. So I think that, again, that's a lot of Clark's point here is there's more to it than the alliance systems. There's a strategic vision that each one of these countries has. There's a strategic concern that they have, and especially the Russians came to view a general war as desirable of their aims.
So you would suggest, as I understand your explanation of what Clark is saying here, that we, generally speaking, believe the entire process that began the war as passive. That simply you lit the match, the imagery has been used all over the place, and once that match was lit, that you could not stop the powder keg from exploding. You're saying is the powder keg was deliberately engineered for this to eventually happen.
The more things that happened, because they did, again, they came to full mobilization once in 1909 and did back away.
Right.
But the more of these things that happened, and the more, again, the Russian counselors marginalized Nicholas, and the more the German counselors marginalized Wilhelm. Clark is saying that their strategic options began to narrow, especially the Austrians.
Well, yeah, because they are a dying empire, and they know it.
So they don't know it. They don't know it.
Some do.
Well, that's part of. In some ways, the Austrian Empire is one of the most advanced of the group.
Really?
It's the remnant of the Holy Roman Empire.
It is, yes.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's a flourishing culture. I mean, Vienna
Yeah.
was
It's still considered to be...
the
And the Habsburgs, I mean,
cultural.
they are Europe.
I understand that.
The history of Europe is the history of the Habsburgs.
But the Austrian-Hungarian Empire is an extremely diverse, to its own detriment, group of peoples that are held together just barely over enormous racial hatred of each other.
That's because they lost the German aspect of their empire. They didn't have one dominating group.
But ultimately, that is
Well,
true.
and the Germans had to share power with the Hungarians, who did not want their power diminished by sharing it with
The
anyone
Austrians.
else.
That's
So
right,
I want to go back to the whole premise here is basically what caused the war is what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
So I'm not entirely sure that I agree with and maybe it's just a difference in how things were taught and the various studies we've done since then. And fully admit you guys have studied the war itself far more than I have. I'm way behind on that. But from what I remember, I don't think that what I was taught about the causes, and granted it's almost always the immediate causes, but the causes of World War One are incompatible with what he's saying, because all of that maneuvering, that's not incompatible with the alliance system.
Right.
The alliance system is how that stuff
Is expressed.
it's expressed. That's the mechanics.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I don't know that he's necessarily saying anything new, at least according to my understanding of the war and how it started.
He's simply saying that the alliance system was far more deliberate than accidental, and I
don't know that I've ever thought of it as
well. And I
accidental.
think you're right, but I think 100 years later, we've become so obsessed with how it actually started. We seem to kind of push off the structure that led to the alliance. It's kind of like it's set in stone by the time we start talking about it.
Exactly.
And
that
we
is
think
part of it.
we think it's always been this way.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of one of those things. And
Well,
that's
yeah.
not true. It is very deliberate. And
Well-
it is also deliberate to produce what it did produce. Because it goes back to that first question you asked, who's to blame? We tend to think that, it was just inevitable because of this alliance system. We need to go back further, it sounds to me like, and start blaming the architects of the alliance system.
Well, yeah, you have to because the alliances are meaningless without knowing why they were put in place.
Yeah. And I think that's part of what he's trying to get to.
Yeah, that's right. You
there's
can't
a
understand the
strategic-
beginnings of World War I by only thinking of those 3 months in 1914.
Right,
Which all history books do.
Yeah, well, that's because by their very nature, history books that we use in school are far too condensed.
Right.
A good example you're talking about how this goes farther back is this. One thing I remember very clearly, and if you think about your history, this is very true. Now, while France and Germany have been historical enemies to our modern times, you go back far enough back, they were very much aligned in certain ways.
That's correct.
Now, that's going way back.
That's right. Well, yeah, you talk about the wars of religion. That's a good example.
Well, even the wars of religion they weren't necessary because Germany wasn't Germany.
No, correct. But ethnically and geographically, those people, to use Robert E. Lee's terminology, those people were very much in line with the interests, certain parts of them, with France, others with Britain.
Because
ultimately
Richelieu supported parts of the Protestants. Sometimes he supported the Catholics. It depended on whatever was good for France.
That's right.
Because France was the continental power at the time. But we're getting segued off of the point I was going to make. So we start thinking about all these alliances, how all of this starts shaking out. Because when you think about the alliances that World War II begat, for the most part, it's the same alliances that we saw in World War I that we saw in World War II. Italy's the one that switched sides, basically. But the whole idea of France and England being on the same side was unthinkable.
That's correct. Absolutely.
But England was seeing itself kind of left out of these alliances that were being built.
Well,
so they were like, crap, what are we going to do? We're on our own here.
That's right.
And again, they were where they saw the competition.
Yes.
It's not Germany
Everything
anymore. We got
changed.
Germany beat. We don't care.
That's right.
The Russians are who we've got to beat.
That's right.
buddies
Because everything
But
goes...
they end up on the same side as Russia, though.
with. The Brits,
the war.
Yeah, the Brits purposely appealed and tried to appease the Russians because they saw the Russians as a greater threat to
The
their strategic interests.
If you really want to get the roots of this right, you have to go back to Napoleon, because ultimately, and I'll go back to one of my original premises. The modern world was birthed at Waterloo. Now, it was before that, and it was with Napoleon that did all that.
Vienna.
Exactly, but ultimately, that's all those things, because Russia is
Go back
seen.
to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 if you want. I mean,
Yes.
Russia is seen after 1812. Russia is seen as the enormous continental boogeyman who defeated the undefeatable.
right. When really,
And France,
granted, it happened in Russia, but I wouldn't necessarily give Russia all the credit.
nevertheless,
But yes, it happened in Russia.
Snow.
that's correct.
Snow
It
helped.
was
Snow helped a lot.
Nevertheless, that's the image that comes away from it.
Yes.
And after Waterloo, in particular, France is descending, Germany is ascending. The hatred that Germany, Prussia in particular, Blucher's a great example, hatred of everything French, because France and its culture has been imposed on all of Europe here for a better part of a decade. That is never forgotten, and it only is exacerbated by Napoleon III being a dumbass and starting the Franco-Prussian War, and in the light of Bismarck being the genius that he was, cleaning their clocks. Now all of a sudden Germany has realized we are no longer this backwater polyglot of loosely allied folks. We are gluten iron. We kicked Napoleon's ass, his descendants. Nothing can stand in our way. This is the German mindset.
There's a
that's
really big
going-
gap, though, between Napoleon and the Franco-Prussian War.
That's correct. But that's the coalesce, among many other things, the coalescing of Germany as to a unique people. Napoleon started that. They began to see themselves as Germans. Without that galvanization, Bismarck would have had a much harder time in creating the not modern German state.
So, since you're not finished yet, does it look like he's leading to a particular here's who started it, or what? Or have you gotten that far yet?
I think what he's hitting on is there's a slice of the pie for everybody. Again, you got the French emboldening the Russians. You got the Brits emboldening the Russians, and we're kind of drifting away from the idea of having détente with the Germans because, hey, we got the Germans beating this Navy race. We don't care anymore. Of course, again, the Serbians, total lunatics. So there is a huge chunk of the blame
We
for
by
the Serbians.
no way mean to impugn any modern-day Serbians. Because they're crazy. Sorry.
So, but part of what I'm getting to though is what I find shattering is again just how much of a role the Russians play in this. They have a council of ministers that are working very hard to sideline Nicholas. Again, we think of these autocrats as having all this power. Really, the power in Russia and even in Germany is in a handful of people.
Military class in both cases. Certainly in Germany.
Certainly in Germany, but a little less in Russia. But eventually they do start to push the peace party type guys out and bring in more people who are comfortable with a military solution to the problem, which again is the same thing as always. They want the Straits. So again, what I'm finding this shattering to find out, geez, the Russians were dicks in 1914. Then they spent 70 years as commie dicks. Now they're not commies anymore, and they're still massive dicks.
So basically your premise of this entire thing is Russians are dicks.
The Russians are dicks, and they have been for a long time. And it's like this bizarre continuity of, you know what? I think we could start a war down here in the Balkans. Because this impression that Nicholas was reluctant to go to war. Nicholas may have been, but they were going to talk him into it anyway.
So you're suggesting then the only entity, who really wanted a war was Russia.
They thought that was the
The power
path the path to their goal.
Path to glory, path to power.
Well, hold on. I don't. I
No,
think
it's the path to their strategic goal.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I don't dispute the glory. I don't think you can lay this.
I know. I'm attempting to
Russia, primarily because what they were looking for was not a continental war. Okay, because they could care less about
Western Europe.
Well, but they saw that as the strategic method by which there would be a dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire.
But what's going on in France? Screw that.
No.
Bunch of frogs.
Well, that's correct.
Okay.
As long as the money kept coming.
As long as the money kept coming. They were a tool, a means to the end. But they were not looking to touch off this massive
I
continental
submit
war.
to you, and I think we all agree with this, nobody had any clue that it was going to go where it went.
Well, no, because again, this is the first modern
That is correct.
war.
That was, nobody had any idea. They presumed over quick, Turkey's cut up, I get my big piece of it, and we're all happy again, because that's what had been kind of going on. The Franco-Prussian War is a good example. It's very brief, very quick.
The Germans did not see it as something quick. They thought if it started, it would be a knockdown drag out.
They were probably wiser than some.
And that was what they wanted was...
Well, that's hence the Schlieffen Plan. They knew they had to have that.
They had to knock France out.
Yeah,
France knew that they would be...
the target.
Again, that was France's strategic piece, is they knew they could not hold off Germans by themselves, so therefore, whatever the Russian calculations are, we've got to change that to make it where the Russians see the Germans as the primary enemy.
Right.
Even though the Germans, or the Russians,
Russians
their antagonism is with the Austrians, because they're vying for power over the Balkans.
Right.
And the Balkans are next door to what the Russians really want.
Right.
But
they're
the Russians,
looking to get, like I said, it's the warm water port. They're looking to get into the
Austria
Mediterranean
and Germany
or
were
wherever.
fairly joined at the hip.
yes, and that's what
the
France
intention.
is telling
So
the Russians.
basically, they're both asking the same thing. They're just each are attacking different ends. Or
The French become comfortable with the idea of
Germany.
there's going to be a war.
That's right.
We might as well start in the Balkans like the Russians want.
That's right.
And again,
They just want to make sure
what's
that
going
Germany
on
gets
is
dragged
the
in.
Russians, even after getting their clocks cleaned by the Japanese, think they have rebuilt enough this one group. Okay,
Yeah.
again, they push the peace guys out of the Council of Ministers, and the guys that take over become comfortable with the idea of a generalized continental European war touched off in the Balkans because of their strategic goal of cutting
Because
up
they
the Ottoman
believe,
Empire.
and perhaps rightly so, that they can handle Austria and they can handle Turkey. And they're willing to work on Germany as long as you've got France and Britain on the other side. So they all get what they want, a two-front war.
Yeah, well, see, I don't even
And
know
it
that
goes where
we
they
think of
never-
it as a two-front war. I don't know that anybody before the war would have thought in those terms. Because you got to remember,
Only the French and Germans are thinking in that way.
Because they're they have to.
to a degree. What I'm talking about, though, when we think of a front war, a two-front war, where the front is, it's much more defined than any war that Europe had ever seen.
Well, yeah, the entire
Wars-
concept of front was irrelevant before this.
Right. Because before this, there were battles,
That's correct.
sometimes months or even a few years between battles and in something like the 30 Years' War, okay, or the 100 Years' War. There wasn't a continuous battle going on for 100 years or even 30 years. And so you had much smaller armies
Well, even the
that were
Napoleonic Wars
on
were-
foot or horseback at best.
Yeah.
And so wars were very local. Okay, so yes, you may have fighting going on over here, and you may have fighting going on over here. By the way, I pointed over here to my right and to my left, since you can't see that. But they weren't. You could almost make the argument that prior to World War I, these were separate conflicts. There was no coordination. There was no communication. There was, armies fight, and maybe they'll seize a town, and the town will maybe they'll resist and they'll get plundered, or maybe they'll surrender and it goes much easier on them.
Well, certainly in the medieval times, you're exactly right.
Well, even up into
Napoleon changed a little bit of that, though, because his were nationalist scales. However, you're exactly right. They all came down to a given big battle at one time or another. Then everybody makes the peace. They reallocate resources and reallocate territory.
Right, redraw the map.
That's correct. And
exchange their goods, their gold,
that's
whatever.
exactly right. And the war continues, potentially, in Napoleon's case, because he's never satisfied.
Right. But for the most part, though, this I think is the first time where you've got, even with Napoleon, he had a massive army.
Correct.
But it was still one guy going from west to east, basically. Okay?
Ultimately, that is correct.
Yes. Here,
over a period of years.
Yes, over a period of years.
And fairly strategically well done, because he has to defeat each one
right.
in their own time. In
and
fact,
I'm not...
his entire strategy was based on the fact of keeping Russia out of it at first.
Yes.
His rapprochement with them on the I don't remember what river it was. Him and Alexander III basically became peaceful buddies, because we're not going to attack you, you're not going to attack me, which left everybody else free for Napoleon to plunder.
Right.
And once that's all done, he's coming your way.
Right. But still, it's the prior type of warfare.
Correct.
On a larger scale.
Right. Constant warfare is unheard of.
Exactly. Constant warfare is unheard of. So that, which plays to your point about, everybody thought this was going to be quick.
That's right.
Except maybe Germany.
Yeah, the Germans knew they would have their
They
hands
probably
full.
didn't think this was going to be a 4-year slog it out in the trenches, though.
Well,
nobody saw that coming.
Well, because
nobody had been under fire by machine guns or gas or the long ranges that rifles could hit now. So all of that
machine guns or
made
large
the
howitzers
war what it was. I still think, and I
Germany-
haven't read this book, I still think a lot of the original pre-20th century thinking goes into why the war starts.
No question. No question.
We look at it with modern eyes, and we talk about, there's a two-front war.
Yeah, because
that's a new thing entirely.
They all have the modern technology.
But nobody had ever used it.
And they didn't understand it. And that, to me, seems to be... I get many won't.
Right.
But I would think that Germany should, because of their military esprit... My God, they live, eat, breathe, and sleep tactics all day long.
They were the first to have a general staff that we think of today.
That is exactly right.
Where they make plans for everything.
So why in the world did they not understand or conceive of the enormous killing power that is at their disposal?
Well, perhaps they did. What they didn't see was that it still wasn't to the point where... Because remember, they're still moving at the pace of a walk. There's no armor yet.
True, but trains change that, though.
Yeah, but that only gets you to the fight.
That's correct.
Once you're there, it's a little bit different.
Well, because it is now 100% defensive. And it never had been before.
Defenders always have the advantage.
That's correct. Because you can literally stop an attack dead in its tracks.
Yes, you can
That
now,
has
yeah.
never been the case before. Nobody could ever do that.
And I don't think even with the Germans planning, I don't think they could have seen ultimately how that was going to play out. Because nobody ever used this stuff before.
Correct.
They saw what it could do. So they were probably thinking...
And there are examples...
I don't care how much it is, just give me a whole lot of it.
Of conflict in Europe with these armaments. Because there's 2 Balkan Wars in 1912 and 1913. And that plays in, again... what the Austrians are thinking, what the Russians are thinking, what the Serbians, the Bulgarians, all that.
Was the Russo-Japanese War used with modern weapons?
Yeah.
So why in the world weren't the Russians aware of this?
The pace was moving really fast,
Well,
and they thought
There
they
was
were
a
ready.
large naval
thought they
contingency
were ready.
that war too.
And it's
But
also on the other side of the world, too.
Yeah.
I get some of that.
I mean, but there was something to examine, only it was localized to the Balkans.
Right.
It was not large enough to really be noticed.
To really
to the extent
understand.
that we're suggesting it should have been.
Right. Well, there was no internet.
Tactically, anyway.
And
they're
how much
involved in the.
How much credence are they going to give the Serbians? As far as did they use the tools properly? Because you got to remember,
Everybody really, they were hating on the Serbians bad. They considered
but the Bulgarians are involved, the Serbians are involved. The 2 wars are pretty interesting in that the Serbians and the Bulgarians in the first one were buddies, taking over stuff from the Ottomans, which again plays into the Russians. Hey,
I
guess
want some of
what?
that.
The Ottomans are they can't even hold off the Serbians and the Bulgarians. They're gonna fold their tents. And then the second war is the Bulgarians and the Serbians turn on each other over the spoils of beating up the Ottomans.
Which kind of gives you an amazing, and not to slide off onto this, but we're getting a little tactical here for a moment. Gallipoli should have been the easiest cakewalk that ever happened, and the Australians in particular got their asses handed to them by the quote unquote sick man of Europe. Churchill's policy and plan was sound, and yet, what happened?
It's just too big a theater for the coordination possible at that time.
See,
They were
that
able
kind
to
of
bring
goes to my point about how this started. Everybody's thinking local,
Yeah.
And the sweep is
but
just
it's
too
much
big.
bigger.
Yeah, and again, that's what I was trying to get to with these Serbian and these or the Balkan Wars in 12 and 13. Again, they're using the modern weapons, but the sweep is just not large enough
Well,
for
the
everybody
terrain
to
is different.
Well,
understand.
same as
Yeah.
Russo-Japanese. It doesn't register. It's not big enough for them to notice.
So
nor
when you
prolonged
start
enough.
talking about the sweep of the Schlieffen Plan, or what there was of it by
Yeah.
the time you get to 1914, it's a huge theater all across France. So
Well,
anyway,
you have to give them credit. They damn near pulled it off. It was
did. Close.
it was
Very close.
meticulously planned and executed. There were just a couple of things that all it takes is one or two things to go wrong.
Well, we've seen that in everything.
That's
you
right.
know, a couple of commanders changing their minds, and
That's
I'm
right.
going to go left instead of right, and then you open up the
Somebody
gap.
wrapping up their cigars in General Order 191 and forgetting them somewhere. I mean,
Well, yeah, or Dan Sickles decided, I'm going to go out front today. And we go all the way out, move out, all this stuff and kind of put yourself on your own. I mean, yeah, we could. This is not a new issue, believe me.
right.
So, okay, well, mostly what I wanted to wrap up with is, wow, this book is something else. I really do recommend it. And again, I'm only about halfway through it, and it's just tremendous.
So what
but
time period does it cover?
Really about 1900 to the assassination.
Okay.
So this is pre-war. This is not
Right,
tactics.
it's-
This is
no,
causal.
it's strictly how all the European powers sleptwalked into this conflagration.
So this would be a very good book to begin with, but to actually go into the war, you need to go with something like
Keegan.
Keegan or Meyer. Meyer's a very good one. A World Undone.
Well, my three that I always like are Keegan,
Strachan
Strachan, and Marshall.
and Marshall. Yeah,
SLA Marshall.
Yeah,
so to me, that's like a three-piece because they cover different pieces.
I prefer
of the war.
G.H. Meyer. I think it's a more accessible book, A World Undone, and it is also the second book, The World Remade, which covers the post-war world and how it came into what it became.
What is it? Paris 1919?
That's exactly
another
Yes.
good one.
Yes.
That's another good one.
That's right.
So
All
this
of these
really,
books-
makes for a bookend to that. But he's talking, about again. There's no question the Serbians were just basically lunatics, and there is this.
Well,
You know.
there's valid reasons for that too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
They were extremely
Well,
oppressed and repressed
basically, a terrorist organization, the Black Hand, reaches all the way into the highest levels of Serbian military, and the Serbian military basically runs the government because they'd already shot one king and got rid of him. So this is where that starts out, is the Serbian revolution of the early 1900s, where they have a king they don't like, they shoot him, replace him with somebody that's more pliable, and then it just kind of
At
goes
the
from
time,
there.
Serbia is nominally part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
This
correct?
this would basically be the
No. Remember, the Serbians get independence from the Ottomans,
That's right.
and it becomes to
that
them.
whole area is hard to keep
Yes,
straight.
and what they're trying to do, and where the friction with the Austrians comes in, is over Bosnia,
Right.
because
They see it
in
as
1909, well, let's put it, the Austrians run Bosnia, but in 1909 they actually annex it, and that's a crisis, and that's what starts again pushing the Austrians and the Russians into mobilization.
Right.
And again, he talks about in here the Austrians mobilize and the Russians mobilize, but they back down. And we kind of
We skim over that.
we get to 1914, and our thoughts are, what we've been told is, well, once everybody mobilizes, there's no backing down. Well, they did it once.
Right.
But what became harder is, again, the Austrians can't mobilize, demobilize, mobilize, demo over and over again. It's too expensive, and it puts too much strain domestically.
I think the assassination is probably a better reason for not. You've got national issues there. I mean, nobody's going to let that slide.
That's correct.
I mean, that's
because Serbia to them has been a thorn in their side. It shouldn't be independent. It should be theirs.
But there's only one guy in Austria who beats the drum for war constantly, and that's Hotzendorf.
Right.
The rest of them are kind of like,
do we really want to do this?
I mean, even after Ferdinand is killed, I mean, Franz Joseph is like happy to pass him over anyway and hand his, heir presumptive to somebody else.
Carl. Who eventually becomes the...
I mean, because Franz Ferdinand's not Franz Joseph's favorite guy.
He's all that's left.
And Franz Joseph, he's ancient at this point, too.
Absolutely, yeah.
He's been on the throne 60 years.
Much longer than... I mean, he dies in 15, I think it is.
15 or 16, yeah. So, I mean, the Austrians are not... They're not, like, consumed with the war.
All they needed would have been a good reason not to fight, and they could have demobilized.
They could have pulled back even after the assassination.
Okay, that's that could be true, given some kind of punishment. But that was kind of my point.
But that's why they never backed down from the ultimatum. The Russians backed them, and the Russians didn't back them like what we've been told. Is my opinion. We've been told they backed them because it's Slavic brotherhood, it's Orthodox religion. And Clark's arguing, if I'm understanding him correctly, the Russians back them because they want this to touch off a war.
So they can go out and basically...
And carve out the Ottoman Empire.
Carve out the Ottoman Empire, which they see as almost inevitable from the conflict. And that's actually pretty logical.
So this might as well be the thing that starts... something's going to start the war. This might as well be it. Hey,
and Austria
Serbians,
only did not
we got your back. Tell the Austrians to stuff the ultimatum. So then the Austrians
turn around to Big Brother Kaiser and say, "Oh, they gonna treat me mean. Please help me."
So then the Kaiser
which
says,
had to be very humiliating.
But they already had the alliance system, and
I know
Kaiser's willing to do this because he recognizes.
No, I get that. But I go back to who the Austrians are.
Yeah,
they were the central power in Europe for centuries. And for them to have to go to the Kaiser, who's the head of a country that didn't even exist when their emperor was born.
Very true.
To get, for help in this, it had to be humiliating. Had to be. Because, part of that whole autocrat thing, a lot of the national image is tied up in that. Yeah. Whether it's,
part of the issue,
and that's
valid
part of
one of the things we haven't really talked much about. One of the reasons for the weakness of both Russia and Austria is the enormous bureaucracy that is involved in both government levels. Germany didn't have a lot of that. They were very efficient, and yet all three of these are technically autocracies, but Germany was functional.
The bureaucracies run all three.
That is correct.
The Russian
but it's efficient in Germany.
Incompetent.
Yes.
The
German...
Well, it's designed to be incompetent in many ways.
Yeah, that's correct.
But he makes an argument, too, that the Austrian bureaucracy is actually pretty good, considering the tensions pulling the country apart all the time anyway, and the limitations of...
Well, it's the only
Hungarians not willing to share any power.
Only the only thing that has held them together as an entity is the bureaucracy, because otherwise they are a polyglot group that will eventually break apart, as indeed we have done today.
All right, so that's the second time you've used the word polyglot. I love it.
Absolutely, that's right.
All right,
so I just want to bring that out, but we got to wrap up.
Yeah, we need to wrap up here. So, what I'm getting out of all this,
tell us the takeaway.
This is going to be a poor takeaway because really what I'm getting out of all of this is we still don't know who started the damn war. I mean,
other than the assassination of Franz Ferdinand.
Well, that's the immediate.
Yeah.
I mean, there are so many, and really,
Well,
anybody who's done a decent study of history, not just what you get in high school, because especially nowadays, that just sucks. But at least from what I remember of my high school class, maybe I just had an exceptional. Well, I also had Maggie Mahoney too.
That's correct.
Now Maggie probably is where a lot of this stuff came
That's
from.
correct. May she rest in peace.
But because I mean, we all had Western Civ, so there's all kinds of stuff going on. Now, I would say that. What was the Serbian's name? I forget his name. Do you remember?
Which one?
The one that killed the Archduke.
Gavrilo Princip.
Princip. That's Princip. So, Princip is the excuse.
Right.
I think everybody recognizes that.
That is correct.
But I would say that World War One, what became known as the Great War, and then World War One, would have started somewhere. Somebody else would have found something else would have happened. I think because of all the stuff leading up, all the maneuvering between the nations, between the cousins.
That's right.
Between the cousins.
Right.
Cousin Nikki, cousin Willie, and cousin Georgie. Yes.
Right.
As the letter that
And
circulated.
again,
was-
that's another piece of this to me that strikes me is, again, Nikki, Wilhelm, autocrats, George V figurehead, but in a lot of ways, their powers are about equal. Nicholas is a figurehead too. Things are done in his name,
Yeah.
but they could have talked him into anything.
Yeah.
They could have the council of ministers could have talked him into anything.
The position was not a figurehead; just Nicholas himself was.
That could very well. I mean, that's an entirely different
Yeah, that's right.
discussion.
How much time do you got?
But how much time do you got? How many episodes do you want to record tonight? I guess what I'm saying is what I'm trying to get here is not that this was a pointless discussion, but we're really kind of left where we were, and it's kind of what I guess, because I haven't read the book either, but I'm going to put it on my list because it sounds fascinating. Is that there is no one cause?
No,
There is no one cause.
We've been searching for it for 100 years, wanting it to be that way.
Right. Because, I mean, we look at World War II and we like to say, well, Hitler. But you don't have Hitler without World War I.
Absolutely. No question.
And really...
We have done... I mean, we've always contended this. There is... The 20th century as we know it is because of World War I.
Absolutely.
I mean, you don't send men to the moon without World War I.
Right. Because
correct.
you don't have World War II. That's where you get rockets.
And you don't have a competition.
Well, that's not where you get rockets, but that's where it really takes off.
That's right.
Because there were rockets in 1905.
Hook and loop fasteners, Neil Armstrong,
Yeah.
microwave ovens. That's not, no. But you don't have a competition with the Russians either.
Right. So, as for a cause for World War One, there's no one single thing. To me, I've always thought of it as that perfect storm, where you look at 19th century thinking and maneuvering in political machinations, but you do it in a modern era. I mean, think about what would happen if you took those players with today's technology.
That's a piece
It's
of
a
it too.
nuclear conflagration.
That's a piece of it too.
It's over, right?
The diplomats wouldn't use newer forms of communication because that's not what diplomats do. There was a form to diplomacy that was very rigid. None of them would step out of it.
Right. Well, and that's very much that thinking permeates the Western Allies, because at that time none of the generals ever saw the front. Yeah. That's one of the reasons why World War One was so bad.
Well, perhaps
Nobody ever got to the front to see what the hell they were doing, sending those guys into the meat grinder.
Then perhaps we could make this possible premise then. The true and only cause of World War One was
sin.
Was the inability of anyone to truly think beyond convention.
That's a big piece of it.
Yeah, that's
being
a big piece.
prisoner of convention.
The prisoner, the disease or the virus of conventional thinking was everywhere.
Yes,
Take that away at any significant point, and it changes everything, possibly to the point of never happening.
Yeah, I would go as far as this is part of it, because it's part of that conventional thinking. But I think it's a big enough part that it's separate.
I can give you a good example of this where we can see this in a very, very clear way using recent television series. We've seen Doctor Who. Do you remember the episode where, this is under David Tennant's tenancy, where the Doctor becomes human in the spring of 1914?
Yes.
And the world that he inhabits is very, very much about the glory and the honor and the wonders of war. They're teaching boys in the British schools how to fire machine guns. That's how it works. And the intention is for it to illustrate, and it does it very clearly and very well, by the time the war is finished, all that nonsense is over, and nobody thinks of it ever again. And this can also be seen in Rudyard Kipling, in his change. Because, he's lost his son during war. He was one of the greatest hawks prior to the glories
Lieutenant
of war.
Kipling.
That's exactly right. And however, once it got so bad, like it did, and he lost his son, he became the biggest advocacy for thinking, he finally got it right, this is insanity. This has always been insanity, and the joke's on us.
Thanks for being with us here every week at Snakes and Otters, a pointless discussion of eternal questions. Be sure to spread the word on your social media accounts. Follow us and retweet us. We are on Instagram and on Twitter at Snakes and Otters.
Let your friends know that they can find us on Podbean, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and on YouTube. Just search Snakes and Otters Podcast to find us, and please remember to leave us your comments and reviews. It helps people find us.
And you can always send us an email at snakesandotterspodcast@gmail.com.
I'm Martin.
I'm Robert.
And I'm Francis. Catch us next week. Same snake time, same otter channel.